Like Derek, I have a couple of jobs. One is to welcome you on behalf of the Maths Anxiety Trust and to thank Shirley Conran, whose inspiration it all is. I'm also, as I said, Derek said, going to introduce the speakers, but you have all their biographies, so I'm only going to talk for as long as it takes them to get from that end of the stage to this. So apologies to the speakers, it'll be a very quick introduction, but you have got all the details there. And finally, I'm going to say something about the latest data, which is hot off the press. So this is actually two surveys that have been commissioned by the Maths Anxiety Trust, which are telling us just what the position is now, almost at this moment. They were both carried out in April and May this year, so it's absolutely the latest thing. And hopefully this will lead on to what the other speakers are going to say. First of all, there's an Ipsos Mori poll. The details are there. I'm not going to go all the way through them, but this is a pucker poll of 2019 people, adults. So this is a poll about adults. The second one is about students, school students, but this one is about adults. And the data is all weighted correctly and so on. If you want to know more of the details, I've got all the spreadsheets with me, but I hope you don't. The summary of these results. So what does this show? When adults were asked in a relaxed setting whether, first of all, the first question was whether they had recently felt anxious, or sorry, whether at what date, how long ago they felt anxious when presented with a maths problem, if at all, because maybe they never have. So that was more or less the question. And the answer was that 20% of adults have felt anxious when confronted with a mathematical problem, e.g. using mental arithmetic to split a restaurant bill, of which 8%, that's 8 percentage points, so it's 8 out of the 20, not 8% of 20%. 8% of those reported feeling anxious within the last month. So roughly 1 in 12 adults have felt anxious about maths that they've had to do as part of their ordinary life in the last month. This wasn't a uniform thing for age. It actually changed across age groups. And it was more severe in the younger group. 36% of the younger, that's the 15 to 24-year-old people, have felt anxious about maths. And that decreased gradually to 10% of those older ones. Perhaps us oldies have learnt how to avoid it by now. But it was a surprising gradient, and it did decline gradually. So our younger people, our younger adults, feel much more anxious than the older ones. Some of these adults included in the survey were parents themselves, and of those parents of children aged 5 to 15, they were asked whether their eldest child often felt anxious when attempting to solve maths problems. And 23% of those parents reported that that happened reasonably frequently. So we've also got a view of parents that it's not only adults who often feel anxious about maths, but about 1 in 4 of the parents felt that their child often felt anxious about their maths problems. So that's the adults. I should say, finally, 80% of adults have never heard of the term maths anxiety, perhaps not surprisingly. Now we take the poll, which was of school students, and it's harder, of course, to get at those, but we were very grateful, and again, thanks to Shirley and thanks very much indeed to the head teachers at Langley Park Girls and Langley Park Boys School, who allowed us to ask all their students, that's about over 1,000 in each school, about how they felt about maths anxiety. These are just not ordinary schools. In no way are these two schools representative. They're both rated outstanding by Ofsted. They both have about 60% grade 5 in both English and Maths GCSE. The national average is 40%, so they're well above average for their results. and they both have above average. The girls' school actually has well above average Progress 8 scores. So these are good schools. They're outstanding schools, in fact, as rated by Ofsted. The pupils, every pupil of the school was asked to select a response on a 1 to 10 scale, and they were given little sentences describing states of anxiety or otherwise. 1 was very positive, so we start at 1, 2, 3, 4 positive. 5 was an intermediate one, which was I am sometimes anxious about maths. Then 6 was always anxious. 8 was panic regularly, and 10 was the extreme hatred of doing maths. Just hang on to the fact that 5 is neutral, and anything above 5 is always anxious or worse. We also left a space for comments, and I'll show you some of those. The first interesting thing was that the results, don't worry that you can't read this, it just shows that the blue and the orange, the blue is the boys' results, the orange is the girls' results, and these are the frequencies of them, which ones they ticked. So the positive, most boys and girls were pretty positive, that's up the end, 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 is the last of the big ones, and that's the neutral one. And they are small at this end, although there is a bump at the end. But the important thing about this slide is that the orange and the blue are virtually the same, which is very unusual. Girls tend to be more anxious than boys, and it may be related to the fact that this is a separate girls' school. So it's not results taken in a mixed school, it's boys and girls taught in separate schools. So it's not clear whether this is in some way special. Because the boys and girls results are very similar, we put them together, and the overall summary, first of all, 40% of students are anxious about maths, at least sometimes. So if you include the neutral, the sort of sometimes group in, it adds up to 40%. Perhaps not so very different from the 36% of the 15 to 24-year-olds. So that was interesting. They were asked, again, have they ever felt anxious? These are students who felt anxious sometimes or more often, so similar results there. About 25% were in the responses 6 and above, so were anxious most of the time, and that, interestingly, relates to the 23% of parents on the other survey who said their child is often anxious about maths. So again, very close results both on the single schools and on the Ipsos Mori poll. And about 10% say that they hated maths. I should say that on the school polls I've given these to the nearest 5% because they're small and not particularly representative polls. The other interesting thing was the age, relation with age. There wasn't much relation between 11 and 15, but both the boys and the girls peaked at 16 to 17 in their anxiety about maths. So they became very much more anxious then. And for the girls, it continued up to 18 as well. There's no surprises, I think, about what happens at age 16 and 17 that affects that. What was rather interesting is in the free response items that we allowed children to give their views, and Shirley and I have picked out a few that were sort of fairly typical. Some students pointed to the causes of the maths anxiety. I only feel anxious if I come across difficult maths questions, especially fractions. So some of them blame the difficulty, the fact they didn't understand some of the maths. Some of them said, I feel all right just writing down maths, but when asked to do a question out loud, I panic. So being put on the spot in class was definitely one of the things that was often mentioned. And thirdly, tests make me anxious. Those who are familiar with the maths anxiety literature will know that all those are sort of aspects that are covered in the literature as well. So this bore those out. I wanted to put the final one in because it just shows that actually attitudes to maths don't always go, and success in maths don't always relate in the same way to anxiety, because I love maths, it's my favourite subject, but I have a crippling fear of failing my exam and being unable to fulfil my life dreams, so it's incredibly stressful. So it's not only the people who are weak at maths who feel anxious about it, sometimes the stakes are very high for those who are being successful, and that causes anxiety too. Some students related to the role of the teacher. Some teachers put too much pressure on us to do well, which makes us do worse. Teachers go way too fast and don't actually understand that it's really hard and confusing. And I think a positive one for the end, I had a bad primary education developing a mental block in maths. I have a great teacher currently and now feel a great deal more confident about maths. So it does show that teachers, although sometimes rated as negative influences, can be very positive influences and can pull children back. Both heads of the schools said that they were quite surprised about the results, and I think I finish by quoting Dr. Anne Hudson, who was head of the Langley Park Girls' School, who said there's clearly a national issue here about maths anxiety.